Was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 prophesied thousands of years ago? Could ancient Hebrew prophets have foreseen modern Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional conflicts? Is it merely coincidence that a nation dormant for centuries suddenly emerged as a global focal point precisely when biblical end-time scenarios suggest it would? These questions have sparked fierce debate among scholars, theologians, and geopolitical analysts alike. What if I told you that a biblical prophet living 2,600 years ago accurately identified a nation that would play a pivotal role in humanity's final chapter? Would you dismiss it as coincidence, or consider the possibility of divine foreknowledge? The identification of modern Iran in biblical prophecy begins with understanding a crucial historical connection. Iran was officially known as Persia until 1935, when Reza Shah Pahlavi requested that the international community refer to the nation by its endonym, Iran. This name change represents not just a linguistic shift but a profound connection to prophecy, as the biblical texts specifically mention Persia, Hebrew, Paras, in key end-time scenarios. This identification is not mere speculation. Biblical texts mention Persia with remarkable specificity. In the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 to 39, the prophet lists several nations that will form a coalition in the last days, with Persia, Iran, prominently featured. The text states, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Ezekiel 38 verse 5. This passage describes military allies that will join with Gog, the land of Magog, often interpreted as Russia, in a massive campaign against Israel. What makes this prophecy particularly compelling is that when Ezekiel wrote these words, Persia was actually friendly toward Israel. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia had liberated the Jewish people from Babylonian captivity and supported the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel's prediction of Persia becoming an adversary to Israel would have seemed counterintuitive at the time, yet it precisely matches Iran's current hostile stance toward the Jewish state. The book of Daniel provides additional prophetic insights regarding Persia. In Daniel's vision in chapter 8, he sees a ram with two horns, explicitly identified as the kings of Media and Persia. Daniel 8 verse 20. Biblical scholars note that this vision predicted the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire centuries before it happened. More intriguingly, some prophecy experts suggest that Daniel's visions contain multiple layers of fulfillment, with the ancient empire representing a foreshadowing of Iran's modern role. This identification becomes even more remarkable when we consider Iran's historical trajectory. For much of the past millennium, Persia/Iran was not a dominant global power. Following its golden age under various dynasties, it experienced periods of decline, foreign occupation, and relative geopolitical insignificance. Yet biblical prophecy suggested that this nation would play a crucial role in end-times events, a prediction that seemed unlikely until Iran's sudden resurgence following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The revolution transformed Iran from a Western-aligned monarchy to an Islamic republic vehemently opposed to Israel, precisely the posture described in Ezekiel's prophecy. This dramatic shift occurred despite decades of warm Israel-Iran relations under the Shah's regime, during which Iran was one of only two Middle Eastern nations to recognize Israel. The abrupt reversal aligned Iran with exactly the position biblical prophecy had assigned to it thousands of years earlier. Further strengthening this identification is Iran's geographical placement. Biblical scholars note that ancient Hebrew texts describe Persia's location with remarkable accuracy. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylon, modern Iraq, refers to Persia as being toward the east, exactly where Iran sits in relation to Iraq. Modern Iran occupies virtually the same territory as ancient Persia, with its core regions of Fars, from which the name Persia derives, remaining central to the nation's identity. Linguistic evidence adds another layer of confirmation. The Hebrew word Paras, Persia, appears in several prophetic passages, and Iranian people today still refer to themselves using a similar term, Fars or Pars, in reference to their heritage. The Persian language is still called Farsi, preserving this ancient nomenclature and creating an unbroken linguistic link to the biblical texts. Even more fascinating is how biblical prophecy anticipated Iran's religious transformation. While ancient Persia followed Zoroastrianism and later forms of paganism, Ezekiel's prophecy portrays end-times Persia as part of a religiously motivated coalition against Israel. The 1979 Islamic Revolution fulfilled this aspect by establishing a theocratic government with religious opposition to Israel as a cornerstone of its foreign policy. Critics argue that these connections represent selective interpretation or confirmation bias. They suggest that biblical prophecy enthusiasts simply retrofit current events into ancient texts. However, proponents counter that the specific details, Persia's alliance with Russia, its opposition to Israel, and its emergence as a significant power after centuries of relative quietude, were all documented in prophetic literature long before these developments occurred. What's undeniable is that modern Iran's geopolitical position aligns remarkably with biblical descriptions of Persia's role in end-time scenarios. Whether viewed as divine foreknowledge or remarkable coincidence, the parallel has profound implications for understanding current Middle Eastern dynamics through a biblical lens. This identification serves as the foundation for examining Iran's specific prophetic role. As we'll see in subsequent points, the biblical texts don't merely identify Iran as a player in end-times events. They describe with surprising detail the nature of its alliances, actions, and ultimate fate in the prophetic narrative. Could an alliance structure prophesied thousands of years ago be materializing before our eyes? What if ancient texts accurately predicted the exact configuration of nations that would align against Israel in the modern era? The prophecy contained in Ezekiel chapters 38 to 39 describes what many biblical scholars consider the most detailed and specific end-times military coalition in Scripture. At its center stands an alliance between a northern power called Gog, of the land of Magog, widely interpreted as Russia, and Persia, modern Iran, along with several other nations. This prophetic alliance has generated tremendous interest as geopolitical developments have increasingly mirrored this ancient forecast with startling precision. The text specifically states, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company, with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet." Ezekiel 38 verses 1 to 5. The identification of Gog, of the land of Magog, has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. Many biblical archaeologists and historians connect Magog with the ancient Scythians, who inhabited territories that later became part of Russia. The names Meshech and Tubal have been linguistically linked to Moscow and Tobolsk, a city in Siberia. While these connections remain contested in academic circles, the geographical description of a power from the far north, Ezekiel 38 verse 15, of Israel points convincingly toward Russia. What makes this prophecy particularly remarkable is its prediction of a Russia-Iran alliance, a geopolitical reality that would have seemed implausible throughout most of modern history until recent decades. During the Cold War, Iran under the Shah was firmly in the Western camp and opposed to Soviet influence. The idea of a Russian-Iranian military partnership would have appeared absurd to geopolitical analysts of that era. Yet, following Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979 and especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, precisely such an alliance has formed. The relationship between Russia and Iran has deepened dramatically in the 21st century. Russia has supplied Iran with advanced weapon systems, including the S-300 air defense system. The two nations have coordinated military operations in Syria, with both supporting the Assad regime. Economic ties have strengthened despite international sanctions against Iran, with Russia providing nuclear technology for Iran's Bushehr power plant. In 2019, Russia and Iran conducted joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean and Gulf of Oman, military cooperation that would have been unthinkable during most of the 20th century. Even more striking is how the other nations mentioned in Ezekiel's prophecy align with current geopolitical realities. Ethiopia, Hebrew, Kush, corresponds to territories that include parts of modern Sudan and Ethiopia, nations that have developed increasingly close ties with Iran. Libya, Hebrew, Put, has experienced civil war and instability that has created openings for Iranian influence. Additional nations mentioned in the passage like Gomer and Beth Dagarma, Ezekiel 38 verse 6, are often associated with territories in modern Turkey and Central Asia, regions that have complex but significant relationships with both Russia and Iran. The prophecy becomes even more compelling when we consider its timing elements. Ezekiel describes this coalition forming against Israel after the Jewish people have been gathered out of many people and have returned to their mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, Ezekiel 38 verse 8. This description matches the modern state of Israel perfectly. A nation re-established in 1948 after the Jewish people were scattered worldwide for nearly 2 millennia. The prophecy specifically states this invasion would occur in the latter years, Ezekiel 38 verse 8, and in the latter days, 38:16. Biblical phrases associated with the end times. What motivates this coalition according to the prophecy? Ezekiel describes economic incentives, to take a spoil, and to take a prey, Ezekiel 38 verse 12, which many scholars connect to Israel's remarkable economic development and resource discoveries. The discovery of massive natural gas fields in Israeli territorial waters, the Leviathan and Tamar fields, potentially fulfills this aspect of the prophecy, providing a concrete motive for hostile nations to covet Israel's resources. The prophecy details not just the formation of this alliance but its ultimate outcome. Ezekiel describes divine intervention against this coalition, with natural disasters, confusion among the invading forces causing them to turn against each other, and ultimate defeat. While this aspect remains unfulfilled, the formation of the alliance itself represents a remarkable alignment between ancient text and contemporary reality. Critics argue that these interpretations stretch the original meaning of the text, applying ancient tribal and regional names to modern nation-states in ways the original author never intended. Skeptics suggest that the vague nature of prophetic literature allows for multiple interpretations that can be retrofitted to current events. However, proponents counter that the geographic specificity of Ezekiel's prophecy, combined with the unlikely nature of the alliances it predicted, particularly the Russia-Iran axis, provides compelling evidence of genuine prophetic foresight. They note that these interpretations were published in biblical commentary literature decades before the current alignments formed, demonstrating that they weren't simply imposed after the fact. What remains undeniable is that the Russia-Iran strategic partnership has become one of the most significant geopolitical developments of the early 21st century. This alliance, which now includes military cooperation, technology transfer, and diplomatic coordination against Western interests, stands as a remarkable fulfillment of what many consider Ezekiel's end times prophecy. The fact that this alliance specifically targets Israel, with Iran regularly threatening Israel's destruction and Russia increasingly positioning itself against Israeli interests in Syria and beyond, further aligns with the biblical scenario. As tensions continue to rise in the Middle East and Iran's influence expands across the region, the Ezekiel 38-39 prophecy provides a compelling framework for understanding these developments through a biblical lens. Whether viewed as divine foreknowledge or remarkable coincidence, the parallels between this ancient text and current events continue to fuel both scholarly debate and public fascination with Iran's prophetic role. Does Iran's pursuit of nuclear capabilities fulfill ancient prophecies? What if the biblical texts contained veiled references to modern weapons technologies that would emerge in the last days? Is there a connection between Iran's nuclear program and the cataclysmic events described in end times prophecies? Iran's nuclear ambitions have dominated international headlines for decades, triggering sanctions, diplomatic crises, and threats of military intervention. While the geopolitical implications are widely discussed, many biblical scholars and prophecy experts see a deeper significance in Iran's pursuit of nuclear technology, one potentially foretold in prophetic literature thousands of years ago. The biblical texts don't explicitly mention nuclear weapons, a technology inconceivable to ancient writers, but they describe devastating weapons and destruction in the end times using language that many interpret as consistent with nuclear warfare. The prophet Zechariah, writing around 520 BCE, provides one of the most striking passages in this regard. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets. and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Zechariah 14 verse 12. This graphic description bears an uncanny resemblance to the effects of nuclear radiation sickness, where flesh deteriorates while victims remain alive, and soft tissues like eyes and mouths are particularly vulnerable. Notably, this passage appears in a prophetic context describing a massive military campaign against Jerusalem in the last days. Precisely the scenario in which modern Iran has threatened to employ nuclear weapons against Israel. The Book of Revelation similarly describes apocalyptic events with imagery potentially compatible with nuclear warfare. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire, mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Revelation 8 verse 7. Later passages describe waters turning bitter and causing death. Revelation 8 verses 10 to 11. And the sun and sky being darkened. Revelation 9 verse 2. Effects consistent with nuclear fallout and nuclear winter scenarios. Iran's specific pursuit of nuclear capabilities takes on profound prophetic significance when viewed alongside biblical predictions about Persia's role in end-times conflicts. As previously established, Ezekiel 38-39 identifies Persia, Iran, as a key member of a coalition that wages war against Israel in the last days. Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons would dramatically alter the power dynamics of this prophesied conflict, potentially fulfilling biblical descriptions of unprecedented destruction. What makes this connection particularly compelling is the religious dimension of Iran's nuclear program. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iranian leaders have frequently framed their opposition to Israel in apocalyptic and religious terms. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad explicitly connected Iran's nuclear ambitions to his belief in the imminent return of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, a messianic figure in Shia eschatology. This religious motivation mirrors the biblical portrayal of end-times conflicts as spiritually driven rather than merely political. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has repeatedly called for Israel's elimination, describing it as a cancerous tumor that must be removed. These statements, combined with Iran's pursuit of nuclear technology, create a scenario strikingly aligned with biblical prophecies about Persia becoming an existential threat to Israel in the last days. The timeline of Iran's nuclear development has coincided with other prophetically significant events, particularly Israel's reestablishment as a nation and Jerusalem's restoration to Jewish control. Many prophecy scholars see this convergence as fulfilling Jesus' prediction in Luke 21 verses 29-31. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. The fig tree is widely interpreted as representing Israel, with its shooting forth symbolizing the nation's modern rebirth. International responses to Iran's nuclear program have also fulfilled biblical patterns. Ezekiel's prophecy suggests that the nations of Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof, Ezekiel 38 verse 13, often interpreted as Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, along with Western maritime powers, would verbally oppose but not militarily prevent the Gog-Magog coalition's actions. This precisely matches the pattern of Saudi Arabian and Western opposition to Iran's nuclear program through diplomatic protests and economic sanctions, rather than direct military intervention. The prophet Daniel provides additional insights potentially relevant to Iran's nuclear ambitions. In Daniel 8, the prophet describes a ram, identified as Persia, that magnified himself exceedingly. Daniel 8 verse 4. While this vision had an initial fulfillment in ancient times, many scholars see a dual application, with the ram's self-magnification potentially representing Iran's quest for nuclear status to elevate its regional and global position. The passage continues to describe the ram being ultimately defeated by a goat from the west, possibly signifying a future Western intervention against a nuclear-armed Iran. Recent developments have only strengthened these prophetic connections. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, temporarily restricted Iran's nuclear activities, but the United States' withdrawal from this agreement in 2018 allowed Iran to accelerate uranium enrichment to levels approaching weapons grade. International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, Reports have documented Iran's growing stockpile of enriched uranium and decreased cooperation with inspectors, developments that bring the prophetic scenario of a nuclear-armed Persia increasingly closer to reality. Critics of prophetic interpretations argue that biblical texts are being retrofitted to match current events, noting that nuclear fears have been projected onto biblical passages since the dawn of the atomic age. Skeptics point out that similar apocalyptic interpretations were applied to earlier threats like the Cold War Soviet Union, demonstrating the malleability of prophetic application. However, proponents counter that Iran's case is uniquely compelling because it combines several prophetic elements. The specific identification of Persia as an end-times adversary of Israel, the unprecedented nature of modern weapons' destructive potential matching biblical descriptions, and the religious motivations driving Iran's policies. Unlike previous scenarios, Iran's emergence as a nuclear threat directly involves the nation explicitly named in biblical prophecy. What remains undeniable is that Iran's nuclear ambitions have created a geopolitical situation that aligns remarkably with biblical end-time scenarios. Whether viewed as divine foreknowledge or remarkable coincidence, Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons capability has positioned the ancient nation of Persia exactly as the prophets described, as a major threat to Israel's existence in the last days. As international tensions continue to escalate and Iran moves closer to nuclear threshold status, the prophetic implications grow increasingly apparent. For those who view world events through a biblical lens, Iran's nuclear program represents not merely a geopolitical challenge but the unfolding of a divine script written millennia ago, one that may be approaching its climactic final act.